at the University of Minnesota. And what many of us know him for is for his incredible provision of public goods. So both not only has he done what many people do, including being a founder of the Pop Center at the University of Minnesota. He was also a president of PAA. I've forgotten if it was 2014 or 2015. But in addition, there's been this enormous data sets that have been rapidly expanding and which we have all benefited from. So not just US Census data, World Census data, and then many other data sets as well. So time use data sets. It's almost anything you can think of, Steve has been involved in. So Steve, we are super grateful and thank you so much for joining us. And we're excited to hear your talk. So take it from here.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I really am excited to be here. I've given 2 previous seminars over the last couple of decades at CCPR, and I've always had a great time. So go ahead and interrupt me with questions anytime you'd like. This is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to start with a brief overview of the literature and provide some historical context. Then I'm going to talk about a new approach that I'm using to measuring first marriage rates in the decennial censuses of 1960 through 1980. And then I'm going to go through the measures I'm using of marriageability. Then I'll present my analysis and a few brief conclusions. So a lot of family demographers have focused on the availability of marriageable men to explain both the decline in marriage among Black women and the differential in marriage rates between Black women and white women. And this stems, of course, from William Julius Wilson's 1987 argument that the low rates of marriage in the Black community compared with the white community resulted from a shortage of employed men relative to the number of unmarried women. So he provided kind of a roadmap for investigating this question, and dozens of different scholars have followed it. Wilson and Catherine Neckerman defined the male marriageable pool index as the number of employed men in a marriage market per 100 women. And they showed that the MMPI ratios fell sharply in the 1970s and the early 1980s for Blacks under the age of 35 as Black marriage rates declined and the white-Black gap in marriage rates grew. So the most common approach that people have used for the Wilson, evaluating Wilson hypothesis is to develop community level measures of the availability of marriageable men and then use those measures in a model predicting the marital status of women. Generally speaking, in these studies, the availability is defined kind of like the Wilson and Neckerman's criteria, the number of employed and unmarried men per unmarried woman, things like that. But there's lots of variations that account for earnings or different factors. The availability of marriageable men is generally measured for local marriage markets. These are sometimes defined as metropolitan areas, sometimes for other units varying from neighborhoods to states. So there's quite a variety. But virtually all of these studies have found that the availability of employed men does have a very large, significant impact on the marriage rates of women, but they also suggest that some of the marriage differential between Blacks and whites, that only some of the differential in race could be explained by the availability of marriageable men. There's also a bunch of longitudinal studies that look at the impact of economic position or sometimes parental economic position on subsequent entry into marriage. And they also have found a big impact of economic characteristics on race differences in marriage. But like the contextual analyses, they generally find that they can't explain the full race difference, as in the consensus view, as Rayleigh, Sweeney, and Wondra put it, is that something more than class status is at play in the race difference in marriage. So I found only two real exceptions to this conclusion, both by economists. Keenan, Wolpin, and Nakastine and Zimmer both argue that pretty much the whole race difference in marriage rates can be explained by wages or latent earnings. You just got to use the right methods. So, what I do is I combine a new approach to measuring marriage rates with classic components analysis to address two questions. First of all, how much of the difference in marriage between Blacks and whites can be ascribed to differing economic circumstances? And has the impact of economic circumstances of young men on race differentials in marriage shifted over the past half century? So to approach these issues, instead of focusing on the impact of the number of marriageable men on the marriage behavior of women, I use the strategy of just assessing the impact of men's economic characteristics on their own marriage behavior. So what I find as a preview is that from 1960 to 1980, the economic composition is pretty much all you need. It fully accounts for race differences in marriage rates. But in the 21st century, it did decline over that period. And in the 21st century, the effects of male economic circumstances on race differences in marriage rates have diminished, although they still remain significant. And I conclude that this provides a lot of support for Wilson's argument, particularly in the period when he was writing, and also that the long-run decline in the impact of male economic characteristics on marriage rates probably reflects the decline of the male breadwinner family and also the rising importance of women's economic resources in the marriage market. So I want to briefly, before embarking on analysis, I want to briefly describe the historical context. Before 1960, Blacks married earlier and more frequently than whites, and since then it's turned around. I'm going to show you long-run trends in a measure I call a Meniere Single. You probably haven't seen that before. And it's an age-independent measure of marriage intensity that's exactly analogous to a total fertility rate. It's just the sum of the proportion never married at every age from 0 to 49. So compared to other cross-sectional measures of marriage timing, it has some advantages. It captures non-marriage as well as delayed marriage. And most importantly, you don't have to make assumptions about the proportion of the population that will ever marry, because we don't know that now. So the single and mean age at marriage, indirect median age at marriage really do not work for the recent period. So here is the Meniere Single among Blacks and whites since 1900. So Blacks married younger and more often than whites did from, well, really all the way from 1870 to 1950, and later and less often from 1960 onwards. There's the big crossover between 1950 and 1960. So historical demographers argue that the early marriage among Blacks before the mid-20th century was an adaptation to the post-Reconstruction labor system. And the demise of that labor system reduced the incentives for early marriage. In 1920, almost half the Blacks in the United States resided on farms. And the great majority of those were Southern tenant or sharecropping farms. Here's a farm couple in 1941. From the late 19th century to the mid 20th century, tenant farming and family sharecropping were highly associated with marriage and early marriage. And early marriage was essential for a lot of Black families because in many cases, only married couples could obtain a contract for a farm. So then Black farm operators in the South virtually disappeared during the 4 middle decades of the 20th century. First of all, in the mid 1930s, the New Deal Agricultural Adjustment Act, together with technological change, resulted in the eviction of about 100,000 Black tenants and sharecroppers. And here's a picture of an eviction. And then mechanization and corn production of cotton and corn after the war accelerated, and hundreds of thousands of additional farm tenants and sharecroppers were displaced. And with the demise of Black farming, the incentives for early Black marriage disappeared greatly. And 20 years ago, Kathy Fitch and I argued that the sharp decline in agricultural employment in the mid 20th century dramatically reduced marriage rates among the Black population in the post-war period and led to the initial lower marriage ages of Blacks compared to whites. So since 1960, the Meniere Single among Blacks has exceeded that of whites. The gap has grown from about 1 year in 1960 to 4.7 years in 2019. And even more striking is the massive change over time. The Black Meniere Single increased by 12.1 years from 1960 to 2019. Whites rose 8.4 years. So just extraordinarily rapid change. Okay, now I'm going to tell you about how I'm measuring rates of first marriage. So I'm going to use the IPM samples of the decennial census and ACS to measure the impact of economic circumstances on race differences in marriage using classic decomposition techniques. So I'm going to measure rates of entry into first marriage measured as the proportion of never married persons getting married for the first time within the previous year. So it's easy with the ACS. Since 2008, they added these 2 questions in 2008, and it makes it simple to define a population that was either single or got married within the last year, and calculate the proportion of those people who got married in the last year. And so it's just very nice. In 1960, 1970, and 80, it's a little more complicated. We do it by combining the responses to 4 variables: age, age of first marriage, birth quarter, and marriage quarter. So we know that if somebody married, if their current age is the same as their age at first marriage, they had to get married within the last 12 months. And the reason is we know that they married within the 12 months because we know that they had a birthday within 12 months of the census. And if the marriage had occurred before the birthday, the marriage age wouldn't match the current age. So everybody, where they're equal, but got married. But also, a lot of the people whose age at first marriage is 1 year younger than their current age also married within the last year. And we know that that occurred if their marriage date preceded their birth date. So here's an example. Consider a man listed in the 1960 census at age 26 who got married at age 25. Well, the census reference date was April 1st, 1960. So we're looking to see whether he got married between April 1959 and March 1960. So let's assume he got married in May and turned 26 in October. Well, so then we know he was 25 in May 1959. Therefore, he had to have married within the last year. But conversely, if it was the other way around, suppose his 26th birthday was in May 1959 and his marriage date was in October, well, then we can infer that the marriage had to have taken place in October of 1958. That's not within 12 months. And so this does not count as a marriage. So here's the basic rules. People are married in the year if their age mar is equal to their age, or if their age is 1 year, age of marriage is 1 year less than their age, and their marriage quarter precedes their birth quarter. So again, census day is April 1, first day of quarter 2. So these are the combinations that work. If it's quarter 2, their birth quarter could be 3, 4, or 1. If they were married in quarter 3, 4 or 1, and if they're married in quarter 4, only in quarter 1. But then there are the ambiguous cases. If they got married in the same quarter as their birthday, we don't know which one came first. And, those are 3-month intervals. So for those people, what we do is we look at their spouse, and we can use the same rules on their spouse as we used on the person. That can resolve most of the ambiguous cases. So between the individual's own characteristics, marriage quarter and birth quarter and age, and the spouse's marriage quarter and birth quarter and age, we can resolve 90% of the cases unambiguously. For the remaining 10%, what I did was just randomly assigned marriage to the remaining ambiguous cases. Well, to evaluate the plausibility of this method, of the marriage rates that I derived this way, I compared with them with the age-specific marriage rates derived from vital records for 1960, 1970, and 1980. These are only available for people in the marriage registration area, which was established in 1957 for a subset of states that agreed to cooperate. And in 1960, the system was still being developed, only covered 62% of the first marriages. There were also a lot of concerns in 1960 about underreporting of marriages, and there was also a very high percentage of cases where the characteristics were not stated, so you don't really know. It's hard to tell about first marriages. So by 1970, though, they had it much better worked out. The 90% of marriages were covered by the marriage registration area. So here is the comparison. We've got men on the left, women on the right, and the census numbers are in orange. The numbers from the vital registration are in blue. In general, they look pretty good. The census rates reasonably approximate the rates from the marriage certificates, but there are some exceptions. Most notably, in 1960, the rates from the census for people aged 25 or older are higher than those from the vital statistics.
Steve, can I stop you for a minute? There are a whole
Sure.
bunch of questions in the chat.
Okay.
So I guess what I'm wondering is, do people want to just start asking some of these questions verbally?
I can see them here, yes, now that you mention it.
Yeah, or do you want to just take a look at them and answer them?
Okay, one of them is implications of declines in Black mortality for years single in the previous figure. I mean, I think the Meniere Single should be independent. It's like the single mean age at marriage or the indirect median age at marriage. It is not affected by mortality the way a marriage rate derived from family reconstitution, say, where you're linking marriage certificates, birth certificates, that's affected by mortality, but not these synthetic cohort measures.
Yeah, and the other question was about the incarceration point. So
okay, yes. Well, how is the estimation of LG? What's LG?
Vicki, what's LG in your question?
Lesbian, gay, bisexual. Oh, I'm sorry, it's just lesbian, gay.
Oh, obviously, their you know, in this period, you know, in the 20th century, their I mean, it's not only that you can't measure it, the number of same-sex marriages was not significant. And I mean, obviously there were no legal ones, and there was relatively little. In terms of incarceration, I will be measuring incarceration later on, so I'll get to that. And in terms of the registered marriages that became official, they would be missed by the vital statistics unless there's a marriage certificate. That's where the vital statistics come from. So common law marriages would be excluded. So anyway, so we don't know here in this figure whether the census is wrong or the vital records are wrong, but it's possible the census could overstate marriages, like in 1960 at older ages, if respondents misreported remarriages as first marriages. But there's not any real obvious reason to suspect that this problem would be worse in 1960 than it was in later years. So we know that in 1960, the vital records probably had some underreporting under the new MRA system. And right, it didn't count marriages without a legal marriage certificate. And that might have been more common in 1960, common law type marriages or informal marriages than it was in later years. So, you know, if you look at the trend over time, obviously there's a convergence between the vital records and the numbers from the census. Maybe that reflects improvement in the quality of both sources. So we don't know. But anyway, I was generally gratified about this. I thought that it came out pretty well. The National Center for Health Statistics discontinued the publication of detailed marriage statistics in 1996. So you can't do the same thing for the American Community Survey. The Census Bureau did publish a study that looked at the overall crude marriage rates for the American Community Center survey compared with the rates from the vital statistics, and they decided that they were pretty close, and that they thought that it confirmed that the ACS was a fine way to get marriage rates.
Hi, quick question.
Sure.
So in this previous graphs, are the patterns the same by race?
I do not have that because the vital records are not broken down by race in a way that we can replicate. So, you know, I will show you the race differences, but, you know, so I can't compare it to the vital records, but obviously I can compare blacks and whites, and I will do that in just a moment. Okay, so in 1990, the census dropped the questions on marriage history, and so age at first marriage in particular, and so I can't do anything after 1980. So my analysis is limited to the early period, 1960 through 1980, plus 2008 and on in the American Community Survey when the marriage questions were added. So I'm focusing on US-born non-Hispanic men aged 18 to 49 who identify as black and white, or black or white. I do not right now. The numbers I'm going to show today exclude the multi-race population. I tried putting them in, which are only available, of course, in the ACS from not from the earlier period, and it didn't really make any difference. So it seemed like maybe the most consistent thing to do is just to do the single race population. I need pretty big samples to do the decomposition. So for 1960, I used the new 5% sample created by IPMS from the restored 1960 census. We're working on a similar sample for 1970, but it's not ready yet. So I use the three Form 1% samples. These are the three samples that include the necessary marriage questions. So I have 3% from 1970. 1980, I used the 5% sample. For the ACS, I needed to combine 3 years to get enough cases. So I did the earliest 3-year period available, 2008 to 2010, and the most recent 3-year period available, which is 2017 to 2019. So here's what it looks like, the race comparison. And so this is my dependent variable. And clearly white rates are a lot higher than black rates in every census year. And that's, it's a large race differential, but it is, again, very clear here that the race differential is small relative to the enormous decline over time in age-specific first marriage rates, which is truly extraordinary from, as a, not normally what we see in historical demography, things happening that fast. Okay, now how do I measure marriageability? Well, to
Steve, one
assess,
question. So you've sort of shown us kind of some of these graphs. Are you going to be doing anything kind of by education? Because I'm just thinking sort of about all the studies about births out of wedlocks, which show that there's huge variation sort of by education.
yes, well, I'm going to go through the variables I'm using. I tested education. There's no after my core economic variables that I'm going to describe for you, which are income, occupation, employment status, and incarceration. There is no net addition of educational attainment or educational enrollment. So I did not include those. You've got to be somewhat parsimonious with this sort of method. So yes, these are my, I've got deciles of income, 4 categories of occupation, and 4 categories of institutionalization. So I'm treating marriageability generally as more of a continuum than a dichotomy. We've had a number of people show that marriage is more sensitive to income level to employment. And so if you just focus on employment, you're going to miss some of it. So combinations of characteristics have more power than individual characteristics. So I use these 3 factors, income, occupational group, and employment and institutionalization. So I tested all of these additional ones. I was thinking, migration from the South might have an impact, or just migration in general. As I mentioned, educational attainment, enrollment, and then these other economic things, hours worked, weeks worked, class of worker, they did not contribute to the overall explanatory power of the analysis, and so I left them out. So I'm not going to make you look at this. This is the descriptive table of, I'll just pick out a few highlights. This is the percent of Black men and white men in each income decile in 1980. And not surprisingly, Black men are concentrated in the lower deciles and underrepresented in the upper deciles. So that's to be expected. And this is remarkably consistent over time. This is from 1960 through 2019. And on the left here, we have the percentage of Black men that fall into the bottom decile of income. It's always above 20%, gets up to about 27% in 2008 to 2010, which may have been a recession thing. And then in the percentage of Blacks in the top decile never gets above 5%. So this is the marriage rates, another big table, which I'm not going to show you because it's impossible to read. I'll pick out a few highlights. This is the first marriage rate by decile of income. And you can see Black men and white men in 1960. The very top deciles of income actually have a little fall off, but generally speaking, for the most part, there's a strong positive relationship. And note that for most of the most of the distribution of black men have higher marriage rates than white men. That's not true in 2017 to 2019. Down at the bottom, there's still a positive relationship, but it's much less steep. Here's my 4 categories of occupation, which I'm showing here, the white and black distribution in 1960. So whites are way overrepresentative among professional, technical, managerial, and skilled occupations, and among clerical, sales, and operatives. Blacks are way overrepresented among service workers and laborers, and among those with no occupation. This is no occupation in the previous 5 years. So this is the marriage rates for those 4 occupational groups, and the top 2 have obviously much higher marriage rates than the bottom 2, and people with no occupation have very low marriage rates. And this is the final variable. I combine employment status and institutional residence. We got currently employed, much higher significantly higher among whites than among blacks. Not too much difference among people who worked in the last year. But for people who did not work in the last 12 months, blacks are way overrepresented compared to whites. And for people living in institutions, blacks are it's much more common for blacks than whites. Of course, this is 1960, before the huge boom in incarceration, but it's still the case. And here's the first marriage rates by those factors. Currently employed, there's absolutely no race difference in marriage in 1960, and both of them are quite likely to be marry. Then as you go down into these other categories, and particularly the no work in the last 12 months and the institutional residence, the first marriage rates are low, but black first marriage rates in those groups exceed those of whites. In fact, blacks exceed whites for every category except for the current employed. Okay, so one of the things I want to make, one point I want to make about all these variables is they're all, to some extent, overlapping measures, right? They're all measuring employment at one level, which is the core concept Wilson was after. But and normally if you were doing a regression, you would say, oh my goodness, we're going to get all kinds of colinearity. Well, one nice thing about doing the components analysis is that colinearity simply is not an issue. Okay, so I'm using the method pioneered by Evelyn Kitagawa in 1955 and refined by Prithwis Das Gupta from the 1970s to the 1990s. And the basic idea is that you can partition the difference between 2 rates, in this case, between black marriage rates and white marriage rates, into 2 components. The composition component is the part of the difference attributable to differences in population composition, and the rate component is the difference that would remain even if the population component composition was the same. So here's the formula. I have 4 factors, and the reason why is I have to have age controlled as well. And so the other factors are my 3 economic variables. And we basically you calculate the difference in rates for each combination of characteristics. Then you weight the cells by the proportion of a standard population that has those characteristics. So the rate effect is the difference in rates in each cell, weighted by the relative size of each cell in the standard population. And so it's the proportion that's not explained by population composition. And you can calculate the composition effect various ways, but one way you can calculate it is as the total difference between populations minus the rate effect. That's the composition effect. So in order to do this, you have to make some big tables of everything by everything. And you have to make a rate matrix, which is the marriage rates for blacks and whites with every combination of characteristics, and then you make a population matrix, which is the proportion of the population with each combination of characteristics, and then you just do all the multiplication. You end up for the 5 time periods and the 2 races with 16,000 cells. So the choice of a standard population, of course, has significant impacts on the result. There's 2 distinct questions. One is, what would the race difference in marriage be if whites are weighted to have the economic circumstances of blacks? Or you can do the opposite question, what's the race difference if blacks are weighted to conform to the economic circumstances of whites? And it's kind of interesting to do it both ways. So here is the basic decomposition using the black population as the standard. So the total difference over on the right is the difference in first marriage rates per 1,000 single men. The composition component is the part of the difference that disappears when you weight the white population to have the economic characteristics of the black population. So as you can see, the composition component's bigger than the total population difference in 1960 and 1970. The rate component in those years is negative, and big, large negative. So that means that, you know, whites who had the economic characteristics of the black population in those years had lower marriage rates than blacks did. In 1980, it's very close. It's the composition effect is just very similar to the overall population difference, but not quite the same. And then in the 21st century, the composition component has declined dramatically. It's still bigger than the rate component in both years, but it's got a lot closer.
Steve, does it matter which weights sort of you use? So whether you use sort of weights from 1960 or say weights from 2017, 2019, and then going backward?
So the weights are all year specific.
Oh, years. Okay.
So we're you know, weighting it by the characteristics of the of the black population in 1960 for the 1960 analysis, and so on and so forth. So if I you know, if I measured, you know, you can't do this to, and the way I did it to analyze change over time, but you know, you could rearrange things to analyze change over time. So here's the same thing where the standard population is the white population. So the overall results are similar. You still have negative rate components in 60 and 70, but you know, generally speaking, the composition component is consistently lower for the if the standard population is the white population than if the standard population is the black population. And so that means that if blacks had the same economic characteristics as whites, the race difference wouldn't, you know, the composition component is much smaller. And the reason for this is that the race differentials in marriage are generally smaller for men at the bottom end of the economic hierarchy than for those at the top end. You get bigger race differences in the upper deciles of income, for example, than you do at the bottom. This is the same thing, but I have expressed all of these things as components of the total race difference. So you see the total race difference here is 100. And so, you know, you can interpret this as, well, in 1960, these economic characteristics account for 313% of the actual race difference that existed if you use blacks as a standard, 283% if you use whites as a standard. So that's kind of the thing. So you can see that if you use blacks as a standard, you've got a composition component that's over 50% of the total difference all the way through, but not if you use whites as a standard. Then the 20th century, the 21st century samples, 2008 through 2019, are less than 50%. Okay, so we can take this another step farther and subdivide the component effects into the effects of each factor. And for this, I used Gupta's refinement of Kitagawa's approach. And for this analysis, the standard population is the average of the white population proportion and the black population proportion. I'm not going to show you the equations. There's 24 equations, and they would be nasty to put up on the screen. Basically, you just hold. You go through and looked at the impact of every combination of factors and figure out how each factor affects the whole thing. So here's the results. This is the absolute difference in marriage rates. So the top is the total population difference in marriages per, first marriages per 1,000 unmarried people across time. And then you can get the impact of income decile, occupational category, and employment institution. Now, and I should say here, the fact that all three of them are measuring employment with slight variations as to how that's defined does mean that these could be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt. The Gupta's approach is to allocate interactions between the variables in proportion to their strength. So but it gives you a general notion of the power of each of the factors. And it's clear that income decile is the big one, and by a wide margin. Occupational is the next. Somewhat ironically, employment status and institution, these are measured closest to Wilson's original marriageability index. They're the weakest of the economic factors. Age is generally negative, except in 1970, and that's because in most of the other years, the black population was relatively younger than the white population and more represented in the peak marriage years. So when you control for that, it's a negative. I got the same thing here, panel B, but here the numbers are expressed as a percentage of the total population difference. So income by itself, accounts for 158% of the population difference in 1960, and dropping dramatically to just 20% by 2017 to 2019, just a precipitous drop. Oh, they all drop, so does, of course, the total population component, which drops below 50% by 2017 to 19. So these numbers are similar to the ones that I showed you before with the components analysis, the composition component, and the rate component. The only reason why they're different is that instead of having either the white population or the black population as the standard, these numbers use the average of the proportions of the two populations as the average of the white and black population as the standard. So I have one more here. This is the last table. So here I just expressed each component as a percentage of the total composition component, the effect of each factor. And you can see, income's like, close to half, over half in 1960, but, pretty high in the later years as a percentage of the total composition component, and occupation and employment lag behind. Okay. Any questions on this part?
I had a question just about my name's Ungabeen, and just looking at your the different measures for income, one thing that came to mind is if you're not seeing as big differences by race due to income, did you also look at factors like intergenerational wealth? Because I would imagine that might look different between Black and white populations.
Absolutely. As I'm going to explain in a minute, there are a whole bunch of omitted factors that one would expect to be very powerful, and that's definitely one of them. But you can't do that in the census. unfortunately. And, you know, there really are not, I mean, obviously, there have been some good studies of that that have shown that it's a powerful effect. Okay, well, in the early decades of the 20th century, most of the Black population worked as sharecroppers or tenant farmers, and a lot of them cultivated the same land that their parents or grandparents had worked on under slavery. They didn't have very many educational opportunities. They lived under apartheid. It was enforced by violence. Marriage was a central element of that system because farms were family enterprises, and in many cases, marriage was actually a formal requirement of tenant contracts. And so in this environment, Blacks married earlier and more frequently than did whites. Essentially later, very few Blacks are engaged in agriculture. Compared with whites, Black men have disproportionately low income, low employment, high levels of incarceration, and these factors can account for most of the disproportionately low marriage rates of Black men in all but the most recent period. So I think that this provides pretty unqualified support for Wilson's central argument at the time he made it. From the mid to the late 20th century, which is the time he was writing about, Black men who had similar economic and demographic circumstances as white men, measured by these four variables: income, employment, incarceration, and occupation, had similar or higher marriage rates. So I think Wilson was absolutely right about this period, but the impact of these factors has diminished greatly as we move to the 21st century. And so I feel that the reason is probably, you know, the role of economic circumstances on marriage prospects has just diminished with the decline of the male breadwinner family. And at the same time, women's economic resources have become a much more important influence on marriage probabilities, and women who have an alternative may be more selective or choose not to marry. So finally, I think that the analysis understates the importance of material circumstance. First is because it doesn't account for any of the circumstances of women. And second, because it doesn't account for all of the circumstances of men. And this is what Ngubin was just talking about. And one of these is past incarceration. We've got information about current incarceration in the decomposition, but we can't control for the impact of a felony record. Obviously, that's much more common among Blacks than among whites, and a felony record must hurt marriage prospects. We know that job insecurity is greater for Blacks than for whites. We can't capture that with the decomposition. You know, people may have a job, but they may not have as much job security. Then there's perceived future prospects, which you know, we know about current income and occupation, but what about the future? And the future is less bright for young Black men than for young white men. There's no information about wealth or perceived prospects of future wealth, and we know that wealth is closely linked to marriage and that it's far lower among Blacks than among whites. And as you indicated, other factors we can't measure include parental resources and debt. There is no data in the census about those things. So the impact of economic circumstances is probably much greater than this analysis suggests. And I suspect that if it were possible to control for all of these influences on the marriageability of men, we might well find that the net of these characteristics, marriage is still more popular among Blacks than it is among whites, but we don't have enough data to measure it. So that's my story. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. So can we turn this over to questions, Megan?
Hi, thanks, Dora. Hi, Steve. First, thanks so much for coming. I really enjoyed your talk, and you really got me thinking about a lot of the issues that you've raised, things that I've thought about quite a bit in the past, but not so much very recently. So it was pretty fun to get those wheels going again. Your last slide that you just put up with many of the factors that make this, yes, thank you, that do contribute to people's material circumstances. I wonder, I mean, one of your findings that comes across really strongly to me and was very intriguing to me, I guess there were two. One was your findings just reminded me about the variation across the income distribution in the magnitude of the race gap in marriage. And so that figure that you showed us for folks at the bottom of the income distribution, there's not much, if any, of a gap, race gap in marriage,
Right.
At least in the most recent period. But if you pull that back historically to the beginning of your time series, that's actually not true to the same extent. There was a bigger gap, even in the—
Yes, but blacks were higher than whites.
And there was this, yes, and there was this difference across the distribution of income. So you've got kind of this change over time. And so in the current period now, we have a situation where there's no race gap at the lower end of the income distribution, but the gap is quite large at the upper end. And you've got kind of an overall finding that economic circumstances appear to matter less for explaining the race gap in marriage now than economic circumstances did many decades ago at the beginning of your time series. And so that apparent declining in race gap in marriage, growth in the race gap in marriage, declining importance of economic factors for that race gap in marriage kind of raises a puzzle. So the race gap's been expanding dramatically over this period, and you're saying that economic factors matter less. I guess I want to kind of come back to that last slide of yours and not just say that there are other economic factors that might matter, but the extent to which your measures of economic factors actually well capture race differences in material well-being may have changed over time, so that they're giving us a less clear signal now than they were in 1960, someone's income, about their actual material well-being. And we can look at differences in wealth and all the kinds of things that you're describing. And so what might be happening is not so much that economic factors matter less, or simply that these measures don't capture well people's economic standing, but that there's been change over time in the extent to which your measures do well capture people's economic standing. Sorry, that was a lot.
Yeah, no, I think that, right. I think that's hard to know. I can go back to the, oh, didn't mean to do that.
Because if you look, especially when you're using whites as the standard, you have down about a quarter of the race gap in marriage being explained by economic factors in the most recent period. I mean, there's been a real shift over time in your findings.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely declined. My interpretation is that, in 1960, certainly, male economic circumstances in the male breadwinner family, were a huge impact on marriage prospects, and because of the rising importance of female income and just the decline of the male breadwinner family, that it's a different world. I mean, the male circumstances are not as powerful as they were, and that's, I think, what drives the and it could be that we have worst measures, I mean, your argument is that I gather that it kind of these simple measures of income, occupation, and employment used to be enough to measure economic circumstances, and maybe now they're not. And that could be true. I don't know. But I'm not sure you need to assume that. I mean, it does seem to me that it makes a lot of sense to me that males' economic circumstances would be less important as a determinant of marriage than they were.
I agree that that's a really intriguing argument. I think I've made it in print myself. So I certainly
I
wouldn't
believe
distance
you
myself.
have. You may have been
distance
the
myself.
first one.
Yeah, but I do think though that the idea of the, like you're pointing out here about perceived future prospects, wealth, I just wonder, you know, the extent to which the quality of current income and current occupation as, you know, a measure capturing differences in group material well-being has declined over time in such a way that we can't actually attribute what you're finding, at least not yet, to declining importance of male economic prospects for marriage and explaining the race gap.
Yeah.
That really, really interesting stuff. Definitely got me thinking.
Thank you. Other questions or comments?
And Dora has logged off, so I'll be moderating from here. Hello, Steve.
Hi, Jenny.
Ian. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for the talk. So I have a perennial question about Kitagawa decomposition, and I'd love to just hear what you think about how to like address this issue. So when we talk about like what would happen if Black and white men were both in, say, the top income decile, that's different from what we observe. So like when we look at the Black and white men who are actually in the top income decile, the Black men are like really positively selected because you have to like overcome all kinds of barriers to make it to the top. And so thus in every cell, we're looking at this like population where like the selection is different across the racial categories. And thus it seems like difficult to interpret because like as you adjust for more things, you get like this more complicated selection process going on. So yeah, I think like you won't have an answer.
Although I don't really
think
see
about it.
I don't really see how that's different with any other statistical method. I mean, regression, you're effectively doing the same thing. It may not be as obvious, but you know, you're essentially generalizing from the experience then of a small group like that. I mean, you know, the way I interpret it is, you know, one, you know, and I try to avoid using too much causal language. What I like to say is like, you know, Black men who shared the economic circumstances of whites look like this, and white men who share the economic circumstances of the Black population look like this. You know, and you know, it is tricky to, I mean, you know, statistics, it's tricky stuff.
Yeah, that seems fair. So you would say that you're just describing over time, how has the racial gap in marriage changed within subpopulations who are identical along the chosen variables?
Yeah. And you know, I think it's reasonable to use the language of composition component, you know, as Kitagawa does, which is, you know, how much of the race difference overall goes away if we weight things so they have the same composition. You know.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some appeal to it. I mean, you know, I mean, I find it extremely appealing, the decomposition or the components analysis, because, you know, you got so many, it's you know, it's harder to manipulate, way harder to manipulate than like regressions, where you get wild stuff going on all the time. You throw in another variable and, oh, look, everything changed. And, you know, where you got all kinds of assumptions about relationships among independent variables and, you know, interactions and this and that. And, you know, it's just so simple. That's what I love about it.
Yeah, I do think that's a great thing about it. So yeah, thanks for the thought.
Well, if I could bounce on Ian's comment, I think it's maybe not just a question for you, more for the strat people in the room. I think it depends on how you think of the role of income in affecting your chances of marriage. If you think it's absolute income, is what the dollar amount that you take home and that allows you to buy stuff, then I think your counterfactual probably is fine. If you're thinking it's a relative thing, it's where you stack up in the competition against other men in your group, then you're in you're the top decile, and that's it, and that's why you have high rates of marriage. But that's maybe not a question for me to answer.
So when I first did this, I adjusted using the research series CPI, and it got standard income across time, and then I did deciles of that. Obviously it was difficult because, in 1960, there's nobody at the top, and, the top decile, overall was not inhabited very much in 1960. And so, I switched over to doing separate deciles for each census year, which is essentially saying relative income rather than the absolute income. And it worked a lot better. Income became a more important variable. And I think that mostly it's because 10 categories capture more of the variation when you do it separately for each year, because the scales, are really different over time. But, of course, there's also vastly more inequality. One of the problems with the deciles is that in the two 21st century years, 14% of the male population aged 18 to 49 doesn't have any income. So the bottom decile is too big in 2008 to 2019. So the second decile gets too small. But it's just an indication, obviously the top decile in real terms is way higher in the 21st century than it was in 1960. And so, and the bottom decile is much bigger. And so it's just the amount of inequality has just skyrocketed over that period.
So I have another question. Sorry, Wiki. It would be about cohabitation, on which I know you have done a lot of work also to reconstruct rates of cohabitation over a long historical time frame. So we know that overall it has compensated for quite a bit of this decline in first marriage, but I'm not, I should know better, but I'm not sure whether it's the same to the same extent for white and blacks. So,
well,
do you have a hunch as to,
white
if you were
cohabitation,
to add cohabitation, whether it would change the picture?
White cohabitation is like, I think, more than double black cohabitation. So, you've got the same race differential in cohabitation as you have in marriage. So I don't know. It would be interesting in, well, it would be nice if they got a reasonable cohabitation measure in the ACS. We could use the CPS, but there aren't really enough cases. I suppose if I combined like a decade's worth, I could get enough cases to do this with the CPS and try it for cohabitation. But obviously you can't do it going back in time, because the census is crappy for estimating cohabitation. Particularly, well, before 1980, it's hopeless.
Well, I wasn't suggesting you would do it, because I realize that true force it is already. But if you have, from what you know of the differential in cohabitation, do you think it would? So I think it would probably make the difference in rates a little bit more important if you were to add. I was just trying to get your intuition on the question before.
Yeah, I really don't know. I think that if you just add cohabitation in, is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, looking
So
at first union formation as opposed to first
union formation. Yeah. See, I don't know if I really don't know. I'm probably Megan or somebody knows better than me, but I'm not sure that cohabitation is as sensitive to economic circumstances as marriage is. You know, that so it might you know, just dilute the impact of the economic factors. But it would certainly be tricky to implement, but it might be possible. Well, especially its entry into first cohabitation. I don't think you can do that even with the CPS. You can find cohabitors. You have to use National Survey for Family Growth, and then you're not using component analysis.
Other questions?
I guess if no one else has one, I'll jump in with another one. Thinking, Steve, about the argument about the changing significance of the male breadwinner role. I know that you've done a lot, obviously, with local geography. And have you thought at all, I mean, do you have you probably maybe could do something with geography, given the samples that you're working with, and cost of living, cost of housing, different markets, to see if these patterns look different in areas where a lower income might be enough to, say, buy a home or rent an apartment versus markets, you know, where that's very hard to do.
That's a good idea. I mean, one very simple thing one could do would be just to try to adjust, you know, income for cost of living. But, you know, it's also, there's maybe potential for trying to do some kind of spatial analysis. I don't know how.
It'd be interesting. Interesting to think about.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Feel free to unmute yourself or hand raise or type in the chat.
I also have a question. Hi, I'm Michelle. I have a question, especially, you know, as we're thinking about overtime. And, you know, I think an assumption underlying this idea of marriageability is kind of that men have these kind of economic earning potential or, you know, in some sense, these characteristics that are desirable. I'm wondering if you have any kind of idea of whether the way that marriages are formed has changed over time. For example, differences between men and women in income, or differences between men and women in education, for example.
I think that's absolutely key. I mean, in 1960, there was a vast gulf. You know, the great majority of married women didn't work for wages anyway. They worked in the house, and there was also a huge educational gap, and both of those things, you know, the earnings gap has diminished about 95%, and the education gap is reversed. And so, I mean, I think that means a shift of power within both marriages and cohabiting unions, and I also think that it means different kinds of calculations that people make when they decide to enter unions. I think you know, one big thing is that in 1960 or 1970, women kind of had to get married because there were very few opportunities to not get married. I mean, for stuff for them to do. And, you know, it was not only a social expectation, it was, there were very few alternatives. And as women's participation increased in the 80s through the 2000s, it meant that they could make choices and they didn't have to take the terrible marriage prospect because that's all that came along.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm also thinking if you were to do this for women, for example, if you were to look at kind of marriageability and kind of singleness among women, how that has changed over time for white and for Black women as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, we know that, you know, the few people who did work in the mid 20th century and you know, up through 1980, that the more earnings they had and the more education they had, the less likely they were to get married. And that, as we know from, as first discovered by Megan, flipped around the turn of the millennium and is now the other way around. But it's still a much weaker relationship than it, so that now women with higher income and education are more likely to marry than women with lower income and education, but it's nowhere near the powerful relationship you could see in 1960 or 1970 for men, you know, where it was just a you know, huge, strong relationship. It's a much weaker relationship.
Thank you.
I see Vicky also made a comment in the chat, but I don't think it was a question more than a comment. But Vicky, did you want to follow up on your comment?
Sorry, I was just commenting, Patrick's question really was a really important question because there is a status variable, particularly as you are kind of in the lower ranks of the Black community. And that status is almost more important for marriageability than income. So if you had the opportunity to marry someone who was a teacher, that's a big deal, or to marry a preacher. And a preacher may have to go from church to church and earn very little, but the respectability, the protection by the community, the opportunities for leadership made that type of male much more of a marriageable one than, for example, men who were in unions working as like postal workers or garbage men or things like that.
I could try that. You know, we have all these various prestige scores that where, you know, preachers and teachers come out much better than they do on the income. And I could see if that works better. That's a pretty straightforward thing to try to implement. So I'll do that.
Any final questions? Comments? If not, thank you, Steve, so much for such a wonderful talk and great discussion. And I know that you have a pro seminar with a big group of students. So students, please stay on this Zoom link for the pro seminar. And thank you. I wish we could see you in person, and hopefully that'll happen at some point soon. And I'll be seeing you later this afternoon. And
Right.
Thanks everyone for coming to our first seminar of the quarter of the year.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve. Have a good rest of your virtual visit with us.